By the time Brigham Young died, authority in the church had become structured, centralized, and institutional. Obedience was expected, leadership was clearly defined, and unity was treated as essential to survival. But that version of authority didn't begin with Brigham Young. He inherited it and then reinforced it. To understand why his leadership worked the way it did, we have to look earlier, to a time when authority felt very different. In the early days of the church, authority was personal before it was institutional. Joseph Smith wasn't leading a territory or governing thousands of miles of settlements. He was leading a small, scattered group of believers who trusted him not because of structure, but because of proximity. Revelation was immediate, personal, and often spontaneous. Members didn't sustain Joseph Smith because there was a system telling them to. They sustained him because they believed they were witnessing divine guidance in real time. That distinction matters. Early church records show that revelation often came in response to questions, disagreements, or uncertainty. Authority wasn't silent or distant. It was conversational, members asked. Joseph Smith responded. Sometimes those responses changed earlier instructions. Sometimes they clarified them. Sometimes they replaced them entirely. So pause for a moment and consider this. How does authority function when it is still flexible, still forming, and still being negotiated? As the church grew, that flexibility became harder to maintain. Conflict increased. Opposition intensified. Survival demanded cohesion. By the time Brigham Young led the saints west, authority had to become something sturdier. Revelation slowed. Governance took precedence. Obedience became a safeguard. What began as personal trust evolved into institutional loyalty. Was that a loss of something essential or the cost of growth? This shift explains why later questions about obedience, dissent, and accountability feel so complicated. Brigham Young didn't invent unquestioned authority. He inherited a foundation laid by Joseph Smith, one built on intense trust in prophetic voice. The difference is that Joseph Smith's authority was exercised in a fluid environment, while Brigham Young's authority operated in a fixed one. What happens when a system built for movement becomes permanent? Understanding Joseph Smith this way changes the conversation. It moves us away from caricature and toward context. Authority wasn't imposed overnight. It was constructed gradually, shaped by need, belief, fear, and faith. Early saints didn't see themselves as surrendering agency. They believed they were participating in revelation. That belief is what gave prophetic authority its power and what later made it difficult to question. This is why returning to Joseph Smith matters now. Not to relitigate controversy, but to understand origins. If we want to understand how obedience became institutional, we have to understand how authority began as personal. If we want to understand why questioning feels risky, we have to understand why trust once felt essential. Can authority be both inspired and human at the same time? History doesn't require us to choose between belief and understanding. It invites us to examine how systems evolve. Joseph Smith didn't just found a church. He modeled a kind of authority that would later be formalized, protected, and, at times, guarded carefully. Brigham Young inherited that model and made it durable. Later leaders inherited its consequences. So before we ask whether authority should be questioned, we have to ask a more basic question. What kind of authority was it to begin with? And to answer that, we have to go back not to controversy, but to context. When authority begins as personal trust and later becomes institutional power, what is gained and what is lost? Is understanding origins a threat to faith or the foundation of a more mature one? If you value LDS history examined carefully, without fear and without shortcuts, follow for more. The next chapter starts at the beginning.